When the cameras stopped rolling, something happened that never made it into any headline. It wasn't a scandal, or a secret romance, or some wild argument on a dark street. It was quieter than that. So quiet that if you had been standing a few meters away, you might have missed it. And yet, in a way, it was the most important part of the entire day. The strange thing about watching people we admire, people like Keanu Reeves and Charlize Theron, is that we think the most meaningful moments of their lives must happen under bright lights, on big sets, with thousands of eyes on them. We imagine that the important scenes are the ones everybody sees. But the truth of a human life rarely shows up in the footage. This is a reflective story, inspired by that simple idea, that what matters most often happens after the cameras are off, when the makeup is wiped away, the microphones are removed, and a person is left alone with their own thoughts. It's not really a story about celebrities. It's a story about being human, about the quiet decisions we make when no one is watching, and how those decisions slowly change us. It begins, as many realizations do, with an ordinary question. Who am I, someone once wondered, when nobody needs me to perform? Imagine a long shooting day. Not necessarily one particular film, not one specific location, but an ordinary day in that kind of life, the kind made of call sheets, early mornings, and careful lighting. The set wrapped late. The lights dimmed, the crew started packing up cables and cases, and the usual hum of production shifted into a softer, scattered noise. People were tired, but in that satisfied way that comes from finishing what you needed to do. Jokes floated around, along with half-finished coffees and quiet yawns. Keanu stepped off his mark for the last time that day, and Charlize slipped out of character, the expression on her face softening as the director called, "That's a wrap, everyone. Thank you." It was the kind of sentence that always carried relief. But on this day, it carried something else too, an opening, a quiet space that followed the end of performance. The cameras cut, the monitors turned black, and for a moment there was a strange, gentle emptiness. No one was acting anymore. No one had lines to deliver. No one had to look a certain way. It's in that space that something unexpected often appears, the truth of who you really are, when you are not trying to be anything at all. They walked off set, side by side, not as characters, but as two people who knew the simple exhaustion of a long day's work. There was no audience now, only a small group of crew heading home, and the soft echo of footsteps in a hallway that smelled faintly of coffee, cables, and spent energy. "Do you ever feel," Charlize asked quietly, almost to herself, "like it's easier to know who you are when someone hands you a script?" The question hung there for a moment. It wasn't a dramatic line. It wasn't meant to sound profound. It was the kind of question you ask when you're too tired to pretend you have everything figured out. Keanu thought about it. He was not in a hurry to answer. That was part of his way. He let silence do its slow, honest work. "Sometimes," he said, "a script tells you what to say, where to stand, how to feel." He gave a small, almost shy smile. Real life doesn't do that. They walked a little further. A wardrobe assistant passed by with an armful of clothes. Somewhere, someone laughed at a joke they'd heard 1,000 times. The world was simple and ordinary and, in its own way, very real. "It's strange," Charlize continued. "Out there," she gestured vaguely toward the world beyond the studio. "People think this," she pointed back toward the set, "is the exciting part of our lives. But sometimes the most important things for me happen when the work is done. When I go home and I have to deal with myself." The conversation might have ended there if they'd both been more interested in getting to their cars, or checking their phones, or rushing back to whatever waited for them. But that night, something made them linger. Not for a party, not for publicity, but for something much quieter. They found themselves in a small lounge area, a few chairs, a table cluttered with old magazines and half-empty water bottles. It was one of those in-between places that exist in so many working environments, neither glamorous nor particularly comfortable, but good enough if you need a moment to breathe. There was no entourage, no cameras hidden in the corners, just a soft overhead light and the muffled sound of equipment being loaded outside. "Do you mind if we just sit for a bit?" Charlize asked. "Sure," Keanu said. "I'm not in a hurry." They settled into the chairs. The quiet felt different now, not empty, but available. Available for reflection, for saying things that didn't need to impress anyone, for honesty that was not meant for an audience. In that plain, unremarkable room, what they did next was, in the public sense, completely unremarkable. They simply talked. Not about scripts or awards or which director was attached to which project. They talked about something much more basic, how it feels to be seen and yet not known. How it feels to be praised for the parts you play, while still trying to understand the person you are when you go home, take off your costume, and stare at your own reflection. Do you ever feel lonely in a room full of people? Charlize asked. He nodded. More than I expected I would, he said. Especially when everyone thinks they know you, and you're still trying to figure yourself out. There was no judgment in her eyes, no need to reply with something clever. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "Sometimes I think the hardest part isn't being misunderstood. It's realizing that you've also misunderstood yourself for years." That sentence landed softly, but deeply. Misunderstanding yourself. It's not something we usually say out loud, but almost everyone goes through it in some form. We pick up expectations as easily as we pick up habits. We learn to play certain roles to be loved, accepted, admired, or at least tolerated. The strong one, the funny one, the successful one, the quiet one. And after a while, we can forget where the role ends and the person begins. Keanu leaned back, eyes drifting to the ceiling as if searching for memory there. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that if I worked hard enough, if I kept showing up, if I did my best, that one day I'd feel solid. Like I would finally stand in a room and think, yes, this is me. And I'm complete." He paused. "It never quite happened the way I imagined," he admitted. Charlize gave a sad, understanding smile. "Me too," she said. "There's always another film, another interview, another version of myself that people seem to want. But the version of me that just sits alone in my kitchen at night, that one still has a lot of questions." There was no self-pity in her voice, just honesty. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Not the tense kind, not the kind that begs to be filled with noise, but the kind that allows something deeper to appear. What they did then was nothing extraordinary. But in its simplicity, it was quietly powerful. They took turns telling the truth about how it feels to be human. They talked about grief, not as a dramatic monologue, but as a real, ongoing presence. The kind that shows up in ordinary places, standing in line at a grocery store, or waking up too early, or hearing a song that reminds you of someone you can't call anymore. They talked about aging, and the odd surprise of realizing that time is passing not just in the abstract, but in your own body. How the work remains demanding, but the body feels different. How the world keeps asking you to pretend you're timeless, while your shoulders and your knees quietly say otherwise. They talked about kindness. The kind they had received unexpectedly, from a stranger on the street, from a crew member, from a quiet friend. And how those small, unglamorous gestures lingered in their memory far longer than applause ever had. They spoke, and they listened. Deeply. Without interruption, without checking their phones, without looking over their shoulders to see who might be watching. No one was. And maybe that was the point. When the cameras stopped rolling, what they did, what almost no one expected or would have thought to ask about, was allow themselves to be seen by one another in a way that the world would never see them. Two people, not characters. Two lives, not roles. Two human beings, each with their own hidden map of loss and hope, sitting in a small, almost empty room, letting their guard drop a little more with each honest sentence. It did not fix their lives. It did not solve every struggle. It did not transform them into perfectly wise, eternally peaceful beings. That's not how real inner change works. But something shifted within them that night, a small, steady realization. For Keanu, it was the awareness that the quiet, unperformed version of himself was not less real than the one people praised. In some ways, it was more real. The man who sits with a friend in a plastic chair at midnight, sharing stories of vulnerability and doubt, is closer to the truth than the man framed by lights and lenses. He realized that much of his life had been lived in spaces designed to capture him, to turn him into images, to freeze him into moments that could be played back and analyzed. But the moments that fed his soul were the ones no one captured at all. For Charlize, there was another kind of realization, that it was not weakness to admit confusion and uncertainty. For years, she had learned how to be strong, composed, prepared. She carried herself with a certain controlled grace that people admired. But that night, in the absence of cameras, she found a different kind of strength, the strength to be uncertain and still present, to be vulnerable and still dignified. She saw that she was not alone in her inner questions. Across from her was someone the world called strong, mysterious, composed, and he was saying, in his own way, I don't have it all figured out either. Sometimes, what we need most is not an answer, but the simple knowledge that we are not the only ones asking. The conversation did not end with a grand declaration. They did not stand up with newfound clarity and walk off into a perfectly aligned future. Instead, they ended it the way so many real talks end, gradually, gently. The room grew quieter as the last of the crew left the building. They noticed the time. They remembered the early call sheet for the next day. They gathered their things. But before they left, they did one more thing almost no one ever hears about. They made a quiet promise, not to each other, but to themselves. Keanu decided that he would try, a little more often, to pay attention to the person he was off-screen, to listen to his own needs with the same care he gave to understanding a character, to be as patient with his own flaws as he tried to be with others, to let small, private acts of kindness matter as much, if not more, than public achievements. Charlize decided she would give more space to the part of her that still had questions. Instead of seeing that part as a problem to be fixed, she would treat it as a companion. The unsure, searching self would not be hidden away, but acknowledged and included. She would allow herself, from time to time, to set down the armor that had once kept her safe but now sometimes kept her isolated. These were not dramatic resolutions. No one tweeted them. No celebratory music played in the background. They were simple, human promises made in a quiet moment, after a long day, in a small, forgettable room. And yet, over time, such promises shape a life. In the months that followed, they both returned to the familiar cycles of work and travel, of scripts and sets, of promotions and public appearances. To the outside world, everything looked as it always had. The same smiles, the same interviews, the same polished events. But beneath the surface, their inner relationship with themselves had grown a little softer, a little more honest. There were times when one or both of them would remember that night, not as a milestone, but as a reference point. A moment that whispered, "You are allowed to be more than the role you're playing. You are allowed to be uncertain and still worthy." In quiet hotel rooms, on late drives home, or in the rare stillness of an early morning, that memory would sometimes return. The soft light, the plastic chairs, the tired honesty in their voices. And with it came a subtle but persistent lesson. The most important part of a life is what happens when the performance is over. Not just for them, but for all of us. Most people are not filmed when they work, of course. We don't have literal cameras pointed at us. But we still live with an invisible audience, a sense of being watched, judged, measured. By colleagues, by family, by online followers, by people we barely know. We perform versions of ourselves, the competent professional, the agreeable friend, the always strong parent, the endlessly patient partner. And when the day is done, when we finally sit alone, perhaps at a kitchen table, or on the edge of a bed, or in the dim glow of a phone screen, we encounter the person underneath those roles. Sometimes, that meeting is uncomfortable. The quiet can feel like a mirror that shows us what we've been avoiding. Our exhaustion, our sadness, our confusion, our unmet needs. But hidden inside that discomfort is an invitation, the same one that appeared in that small room after the set wrapped, the invitation to be real, at least with ourselves. To ask, gently, who am I, when nobody needs me to perform? And then, over time, to dare to live a little more from that place. When the cameras stopped rolling, Keanu Reeves and Charlize Theron didn't do anything that would make the world gasp. They didn't change the course of history. They didn't make a public statement. They didn't become entirely different people overnight. They did something quieter, and in many ways, braver. They allowed themselves to be simply human, with all the uncertainty and tenderness that comes with it. They gave each other the gift of honest presence, without the layers of performance that their work so often requires. It's in these kinds of moments, unseen, unrecorded, unperformed, that a different kind of story is written. Not the story of careers, but the story of character. Not the story the world tells about you, but the one you come to understand about yourself. And perhaps that is the gentle lesson this reflective tale carries for anyone listening. Your life's truest scenes are not the ones others witness. They are the moments when you sit with your own questions and do not turn away. The late-night conversations where you let the mask slip and find you are still accepted. The small promises you make in silence, to be kinder, to be more honest, to be a little more patient with your own unfinished heart. In the end, the most meaningful transformation doesn't happen under bright lights. It happens in the quiet, after the credits have rolled, when the noise has faded, and you are left with the simplest and most mysterious task of all: to be yourself, without an audience. And in that deep, unrecorded space, you may discover something unexpected, not about fame or success, but about the kind of person you are becoming when no one is watching. That, quietly, is where the real story begins.